Hello, my name's Peter. Welcome to this session on control of potassium. This is my first video and it's going to be part of a series discussing potassium and the clinical scenarios where potassium may be elevated, hyperkalemia, and when it's low, hypokalemia. But I thought it would be personally interesting to discuss some of the physiology regarding the control of potassium in our bodies. So broadly speaking, the control of potassium is influenced by a number of things, and to go back to potentially some of the first year medicine that you studied, potassium is mainly an intracellular ion. So if we have a look at our cells and the concentration of potassium, we know that there's more potassium inside a cell. So intracellular. So there's more potassium inside than outside, so the extracellular space. So in terms of the concentration of potassium, if we were to put a number on it, intracellularly there's typically around 120 to 150 millimoles per litre, and outside the cell it's typically 3.5 to 5.0 millimoles per litre. So when you go to your various computer systems in the hospitals, what they tend to give in terms of the normal is around this sort of range. So this concentration between intracellular and extracellular potassium is really important in regards to the resting cell membrane potential for cells. As I'm sure you're aware, or hopefully you're aware, it's the movement of potassium outside the cell that gives cell membranes a negative membrane potential. So I think the classical membrane potential is around -70 millivolts, but it obviously depends on what tissues you're talking about, whether it be muscle, whether it be nerves. Sort of outside the remit of this video, but it does provide a bit of context into the shifts of potassium and where we would expect most of our potassium to be, and that also links to the clinical picture as well. So let's talk a bit about potassium and potassium shifts. So the main question is, what controls our potassium? Concentration. Okay. And there are a number of things that do control it, and I think the detail won't necessarily be explored in this video because obviously a medic per background, so what I'm mainly interested in is the management of potassium issues. But I will go over some of the major influences, because a lot of the time that does relate to the etiology as well as the treatment of potassium disorders. So one thing that controls our the amount of potassium and where it goes, whether it goes intracellularly or extracellularly, is aldosterone. So aldosterone is a hormone that influences where potassium goes. So where is aldosterone made and what does it do? It's not too complicated, and I'd definitely advise going over the RAS, so the renin-aldosterone system that influences blood pressure, etc., but also potassium concentration as well, and perhaps we'll do a video of that in future. So where was aldosterone made? So it's made in the adrenal glands. And where are the adrenal glands? So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys like a little hat. So here is our adrenal gland here, okay? And that makes aldosterone. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So if we have a look at our adrenal gland in a little bit more detail, we'll find that it's made up of 3 layers. So let's just draw an adrenal gland here. Okay, so here's our adrenal gland. We've cut into it, and in the middle we have the adrenal medulla that secretes adrenaline. And on the outside we have 3 layers of the adrenal gland in the cortex. So the cortex is made up of 3 layers. We have our outer layer, we have a middle layer, and we have an inner layer. I apologise, I'm not a skilled artist. So what are our layers of the adrenal gland? So on the outside we have the zona glomerulosa. Okay, the middle layer is the zona fasciculata, and the inner layer is the zona reticularis. Okay, so those are our 3 layers of the cortex, which can be memorized really by GFR. And if you've ever seen someone's lab results when it comes to the kidneys, you'll know GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate, which is of course different to this, but it's a helpful way of remembering what the layers are from the outside to the inside of the adrenal gland. So it's the outer layer that secretes aldosterone. Okay, so the aldosterone making cells of the zona glomerulosa, and that is actually promoted by another hormone called angiotensin 2. Okay, and there's a whole video that we can make on that. Like I said, it's the renin angiotensin system, which can be explored at a later date. So angiotensin, when it's secreted, promotes the formation of aldosterone. And what does aldosterone do? In order to really understand that, we need to have a look in a bit more detail as to its effects on the kidneys primarily. So if we have a look at a nephron, there's our glomerulus, the PCT, the loop of Henle, the descending part, and the ascending part, the DCT, and then we have our collecting ducts here. So this is the collecting ducts. Okay, and aldosterone acts on cells in the collecting ducts, and these cells are called principal cells. Okay, so that's where aldosterone acts. So if we had a look at the principal cells in a little bit more detail, we can see how aldosterone influences the movement of potassium. So this is our cell, and because it's a nephron, we're going to have urine on one side, the apical membrane side, and we're going to have blood on the other side, the basolateral membrane side, okay? So I'll just write that now. This is our apical, and this is our basolateral. Okay, now there are a few important channels in the principal cells that influence the amount of potassium that's excreted or absorbed from the urine. But in terms of excretion, we have an ENaC channel, we have a ROMK channel, and we have, of course, the classic sodium, potassium, ATP, A's channel. So, as we all know, the sodium, potassium, ATP, A's channel brings potassium in and pumps sodium out, okay? What ROMK does is it allows potassium to leave the cell, and what ENaC does is it absorbs the sodium in the urine. It's one of the ways that sodium is absorbed back into the body from the urine, amongst other ways in the proximal convoluted tubule. So, with that in mind, going back to aldosterone, how does that influence this system here? It basically promotes it. So aldosterone causes the system to go, if I'm honest. So it promotes the pumping of the sodium, potassium, ATPase, and it promotes the excretion of potassium, and it promotes the absorption of sodium via ENaC. So the more aldosterone we have, the more potassium we're excreting. The less aldosterone we have, the less potassium we're excreting, so it will stay in our bodies. So that's one way in which potassium is managed, and probably the more complicated biochemical pathway when we think of endocrinology and the influence that this system has on the body and various disorders that can impact this system. Sorry. The second way is the acid-base balance. So when we say acid-base balance, basically mean the pH of blood. Okay, so pH can either be low, in which it's going to be acidotic, or pH can be high and be alkalotic. Okay, and both these acid-base disturbances, I should say, can influence the level of potassium. So if someone is acidotic, they're going to have high potassium. If someone is alkalotic, they're going to have low potassium. And you know, I have quite a simplistic way of remembering this, and I apologise if it's not the most scientific approach to this, but it helps me remember why this is the case. So if I just draw a cell here, there we go, got there in the end. If I draw a cell here, and I draw a blood vessel surrounding that cell, and the blood is going to move this way along the page. There is a channel here that can exchange hydrogen ions for potassium ions. and it can work both ways. So if we have high amounts of hydrogen ions in our blood because we're acidotic, there's going to be more of a driving force in this channel to push potassium into the blood. Okay? Likewise, if there's low hydrogen ions in the blood, this system will reverse, whereby hydrogen ions will move out of the cell, which therefore means potassium ions must move in. Which would, of course, drop the concentration of circulating potassium. So, as aforementioned, in an acidotic system, potassium will increase on the outside, so in the blood, and in an alkalotic system, the potassium in the blood will decrease, so you get hypokalemia. What are the other causes? So, hydration status. So if someone is dehydrated, significantly dehydrated, the potassium will move out of the cell. Okay. Also, insulin. So what does insulin do to the amount of potassium we have in the compartments of our body? So basically, insulin promotes the internalization of cells to potassium. So if we have a look at the cell again, it's a terrible colour. We have our insulin molecule here, insulin hormone, acts on the insulin receptor, which is a tyrosine kinase receptor, and through various biochemical pathways promotes potassium channels to internalize the potassium, so potassium can move into cells. So one of the treatments that actually hyperkalemia is to give insulin because it causes potassium to move into the intracellular space. What other things can influence the amount of potassium we have? I mean, in terms of biochemical methods or and via hormones, this is mainly it. Of course, we can have pathological mechanisms as well. So things like trauma, things like muscle breakdown, things like kidney injuries, so kidney problems, where you can't excrete the potassium and it just builds up. And all these will be explored in later videos when we talk about hyperkalemia and hypokalemia. Or, of course, don't forget medications as well, because all medications can impact on the systems that we've previously discussed. So that concludes the video on control of potassium. I hope you found it useful. It's certainly a starting point to discuss hyperkalemia and hypokalemia and the treatments that we have for both. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, please subscribe, and I hope to see you again shortly in my next video. Bye now.